In this video, we're going to talk about the 10 most common watercolor mistakes you might make and how to fix them even after the paint has already dried. Welcome back to my channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find art tips and techniques, art business advice and social media training for artists. And if you subscribe and hit the bell notification, you'll get notified as soon as I upload a new video. So just before we get started on those 10 mistakes, I want to show you the tools we'll be using, and I've got one or two really important things to tell you about how to prepare them. So the first thing that we'll be using is kitchen paper like this, and we'll be blotting with it. Now this is something you would do while your paint is still wet. If you see a mistake happening as you go along and you literally just press and lift off, even if it doesn't remove all the paint, you mustn't scrub or rub at your paper while your paint is wet. So the second tool we'll be using will be masking tape. Now it's really important with masking tape that you prepare it before you stick it to your paper, because masking tape is too sticky. It will tear your work. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick it to our clothes and pick up a load of lint so that it gets about 50% of the tackiness removed. So you're in effect making low tack tape. Now it's really, really important that you do this, and I don't just mean press it on your trousers once, do it a significant amount of times so that you reduce that stickiness to about half, because if you don't do this, then when you pull it off your paper will tear. The next tool we're going to be using is cotton wool. These are cotton wool pads. I've got several here. You can see them. They peel apart. Ladies use these for removing makeup. So gentlemen, if you don't have such things in your bathroom, you might have to go and buy. If you want something that you can keep in your box, then there are things like magic sponges available that you can use instead. But you're not going to use tissue paper for rubbing at your paper because it'll fall apart. So you're going to use either one of those sponges, or you're going to use cotton wool pads like these. One more tool we're going to be using is a white oil pastel like this one. So it's important for this that you don't use a transparent wax pastel or candle wax for the particular techniques that I'm going to show you in this video. So now we're going to get on with learning those 10 mistakes that you can make in watercolors and how you can correct them even after the paint is dry. Now mistake number one is a sky with lots of back runs and gaps and patchy drying lines. Now the reason that this happens to your sky in the first place is because you apply the paint too slowly, you fiddle with the paint for too long, and you use a brush that's too small. So in future I want you to use a brush that's much bigger, apply the paint quickly and evenly in a layer on your sky, and then absolutely leave it alone. As soon as you start prodding at it while it's damp, you're going to get stuff like this happen. So first of all, I'm just applying clean water to the whole area. You never really want to work on part of an area because you're just going to end up with a line where the water stops. I'm going to take this water and paint all the way down, and then I'm just going to start really sort of agitating it and putting the brush at a bit of an angle, so we're actually scrubbing the paper a little bit. Now you need to be careful when you're doing anything like this. You never want to work on the paper so long that it starts lifting up, and if you've got a very cheap paper that can happen quite quickly. So, you know, always quit while you're ahead and always adjust as far as you can, and don't aim for perfection. Now, we've pretty much smoothed that out. You can still see a few of the gaps. I've got a lot of water here, so what I'm going to do is just wipe some of that off and get rid of some of that water from the edges there. And now, while it's still wet, I'm going to apply some paint back onto it just to replace any of that pigment that was lost when we were doing that smoothing out and that lifting out. So here we are. Again, I want to make sure that this is evenly and flatly applied. Be aware as well that the pigment that you've used makes a big difference here. If you've used a staining pigment like a phthalo blue or a Prussian blue, it may not work as well as this, but you know, it's always a good idea to have a go at improving something. Okay, so that's starting to dry. I'm going to make sure that there's no water sitting down the edges of my paper that might come on and cause problems in a minute. I'm going to sweep the brush down there, dry brush, just to lift that little bit of water out. Often you get water sits at the edges and it'll come back in and cause you problems later on. And there it is. There's my sky that did have loads of mistakes and loads of drying lines, and now it's all nice and smooth, and I'm going to let it dry. So for mistake number two, I've got paint splatters. I don't know if you can see here, but I've flicks the paintbrush. It's very easy to make splatters, especially if you're working with very wet paint. It will tend to just, you know, the brush catches on the paper and it flicks across, and before you know it, you've got some paint splatters. And if they happen to land on an area that you're keeping clean and white, that's not good at all. So what I've got here is I've got one of these cotton wool pads, and I've dipped it in clean water, and then I've squeezed you know, as much water as I can out of it. And now it's really, really important to remember that point. You shouldn't be working on any of these techniques with wet cotton wool, because all that will happen is you'll make an even worse drying line. But we've got this damp cotton wool, barely damp, and what I'm going to do is just make some circles and start rubbing. Now, if you see this happen and you're able to catch it while it's wet, then what I want you to do is just blot. So what I would want you to do is to get your kitchen paper and just straight on, straight off in one go like that. Nothing else, no rubbing, because all you're doing is pushing the pigment further into the paper. When the paper's wet, it's really fragile, and you don't want to be scrubbing at it like this at all while it's wet, so always let it dry. But if there's a chance of you, you know, catching some of that mistake first, then do at least blot to get some of the paint off. And then you can keep rubbing as long as the paper is not degrading. So this paper is getting to the point where it's starting to lift. It's almost gone. I would say there's about 10% of that paint left, and that's enough that I can overpaint it with other colours. But a lot of the time you'll find that those marks completely come off. It all depends on which pigments you've used. So mistake number 3 is a colour that's just too dark. So I've painted this sky here, but my goodness, it's just way too dark, isn't it? So it's just a bit too full on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some clean water across this. I'm going to agitate it and see if I can lift some of the paint up. I'm going to use some kitchen paper, but I'm not actually going to blot the paper because that would leave lines. So what I'm going to do is with a big flat brush, again, you want to use a synthetic brush, one that's fairly stiff. Could even use a brush that's meant for acrylics, as long as it's fairly large. And you're going to start putting clean water across this whole area. Now, I'm going to be drying and cleaning my brush each time, because every time I do this, I'm actually lifting up pigment. So I don't want to end up with puddles, and I don't want to just keep applying the pigment that I've lifted. So every now and again, I'll dry and rinse my brush with clean water. Get some of this bit down the bottom, and you can see this sky is already lightening up. So I'm being quite vigorous with it. I mean, think if you've ever pasted wallpaper, this is a similar thing, and that's how you should be painting your flat washes anyway, with a bit of vigor so that the paint spreads evenly. So I've got a lot of that paint off, and now I just want to spread it so it's nice and even, this area. I do not want puddles of water. I'm going to run my kitchen paper down the edges of the board just to make sure there's no puddles lying around that are going to come and cause me problems in a minute. And there we are, I've lightened my sky. So mistake number 4 is a colour that's just way too bright. So here I started painting this beach, but my goodness, it's not realistic, is it? It looks like a banana. So I want to calm this colour down, and I'm going to do that with colour opposites. So there are only 3 sets of colour opposites to remember, and I'll write them in the description of this video, so you don't have to worry that you're going to forget them. You can write them down. There's 3 sets of colour opposites. That's yellow and purple or violet, blue and orange, and red and green. So this is 2 yellow, so we're going to pick the colour opposite, and we're going to put a little bit of purple on top, and that will just neutralise that colour and push it further towards a neutral and stop it being so bright and in your face. Now it's important with this that you go easy. There's no point mixing up a really strong mix of purple paint and just turning your beach into sort of a dark brownish purple. So you want to do this little by little and carefully. If you've tried this colour out on a swatch when you started, then that's the ideal time to try overlaying it with different colours. But if not, just start with a watery mix and build up. Now the best sort of paint to use for this is a transparent colour. So for glazing, and this is called glazing, you want to use a transparent colour if possible. So I've got a Ponant Blue Violet here, that's a Talon's Rembrandt colour. It's a lovely colour and it's very strong and very clear. So I've mixed it with a load of water here, and I'm going to start applying it. If as I start putting it on it looks a bit too strong, I can tone it down a bit. Okay, so here we go. It's quite strong, isn't it? So I think we'll just add a bit of water into that, and I'm just going to literally put it everywhere that the yellow is. I'm actually going to change to a smaller brush here in order to get round these little rocks and things. So I'm essentially doing a flat wash on top of this, and what I'm doing is working one side to the other and trying to avoid any puddling. You can do glazing techniques like this on top of anything. So I'm just showing your beach here, but it could be any colour that you've got that's just way too bright. You want to mix a transparent puddle of the opposite colour and apply it over the top. And what you'll do is you'll just push that colour further towards a neutral and you'll dull the colour down. So there we go, there's our violet on top of our yellow, and look how much better that is, and look how much more natural that is for a beach colour. Now ideally you get your colours right in the first place, but if they do go wrong you can adjust them by glazing over the top. So mistake number 5, and I've painted some water here, but the horizon line is not straight. Now that might be okay if you're painting a landscape, but with a piece of flat water like this, it's really important that the water lies flat in the landscape, because physics suggests that it can't do anything else. Water can't go up a slope. So what we're going to do is straighten this horizon line out. So first of all, of course, I want to use some kind of set square just to make sure that I've got a square edge on that. Now I don't have to use a set square, and it doesn't have to be an exact straight line. You could just use, you know, the corner of a piece of paper or something, anything that's got a right angle on, and just straighten that line up slightly. So now I can see where I'm going to be working. So I don't want to affect the sky above. So what I'm going to do is I've got my masking tape here, and I've already prepared it, as I said at the beginning of the video, in order to remove some of the stickiness. And I'm just going to mask above it so that I'm not messing around with the sky at all. So what I'm going to do now is to get a piece of cotton wool again that has had the water completely squeezed out of it, so it's just damp. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start scrubbing here so that we can remove a little bit of that precise line. And you want to sort of go down a little bit too. I've got a little boat here, so I want to make sure I keep painting around here. So now I've made that area much more indistinct. I want to sort out this light patch of sky that of water I've got here. So what I'm going to do is just go over that with some fresh paint. And I'm leaving the tape on because that will give me a bit of a straight edge there. I don't want to leave it on too long, and actually paint can go underneath masking tape, so it's not entirely foolproof, but it'll certainly be a lot straighter than before. So continuing that paint down, I'm just fading it out here by these rocks with a bit of clean water. I'm going to take the tape off while that paint is still wet, but again I need to be careful, so I'm going to pull it at a very low angle to the paper. So anything that you remove, you always want to pull it off at a low angle. If you lift it up like this, there's a lot more chance of it stressing your paper. Now a little bit of the paint has leaked underneath there, so I'm just going to get some folded tissue paper. Let's find a clean part and we'll just blot that before it goes any further. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a mark though I might need to sort out in a minute, but as you can see, I've now got a nice flat horizon line rather than a bumpy slopey one. So mistake number 6 is painting outside of the line. So you can see here that I'd painted outside of this area by mistake. Now what I could have done if I saw that happen is I could have got some kitchen paper like this and folded it and pressed it along that edge like that. So that would have lifted some of the paint out, but as it is, I didn't notice it happen. So what I'm going to do is remove it now so it's dry. I've got some masking tape. Now it's really important that you watch the piece at the beginning of this video that tells you how to prepare this tape, because if you use masking tape on your paper without lowering the amount of stickiness of it, then it's going to tear your paper when it comes off. So I prepared my tape, and now I'm going to just mask off the bit that I don't want to touch. So this is important because if you just rub at it, you're just going to go into the area that you'd painted quite nicely. So we want to isolate that and mask it away from this this piece of damp cotton wool. So this is again a piece of barely damp cotton wool, and I'm just going to start rubbing. Now, masking tape doesn't mask as well as something like masking fluid. So in other words, water can get under the edge of it. So rather than sort of press the tape towards the edge of it like that, where I might push some of the water underneath, I'm going to go up and down so that I'm not going into that area where the tape is, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to rub like this. You can do this if you've got an area that's curved, just make up the curve with lots of little straight pieces of masking tape laid next to each other. So I'm just going to rub. Again, only do this until the point where you feel like your paper might be starting to degrade. And then I'm going to pull the tape off. Now, tape has a terrible habit of tearing paper, so even though I prepared it as I told you at the start, I'm still going to be careful how I pull it off. I'm not going to pull it off in one big lump. So what I'm going to do is just peel it at a low angle like this. So if it's at a lower angle to the paper, it's much less likely to tear. And then it'll just come off cleanly. And there's our mistake gone. So in mistake number 7, I've got a colour that's too dull. So look at this leaf here. It's rather insipid. It looks almost transparent. It doesn't look like it's got a lot of weight to it. And it's a very dull colour. I don't necessarily want to make it darker, but I want to brighten it up a lot. So how am I going to do that? Well, we used glazing earlier on in order to use colour opposites and to neutralise and dull down a colour. But this time we want to make the colour brighter. So which colours do we choose? Well, again, we want to choose a transparent colour, but we want to choose one of the colours or the colour that the object itself is. So this leaf is green. Now, green is made up of blue and yellow, so my glaze wants to be either a nice bright blue or a nice bright yellow. Now, if it was a single colour like red, you would just glaze on top with a brighter red. But if you've got a colour that's made up of two things, so for instance, you've got a lilac, you could use a glaze of blue or a glaze of pink, depending on which of those elements you wanted to bring out more. I want to brighten this and I want to make it much warmer. So I'm going to use a transparent yellow. This is actually some quinacridone gold. And I'm just going to take that right the way across the previously painted dry area. Now, the good thing about glazing is not only can you adjust what sort of colour you're looking at, but it also has the effect of solidifying objects. So if you ever paint anything, you think it just doesn't really look very solid, it doesn't really look like it's there. I don't want to make it much darker, but I just want to give it more impact. Then glazing is the answer. Works especially well for things like rocks, things that are really hard, solid objects. If you just paint a single layer of light colour, they can just almost look like they're sort of not very solid. Okay, so here we are. I've taken my layer of quinacridone gold over the top. So remember that when you're glazing to brighten up colours, if it's a single primary colour, you just want to use a brighter version of that colour. If it's a mixed colour, like here we've got green, you think to yourself, what is green made up of? Blue and yellow, so I can glaze across the top with a brighter yellow or a brighter blue. So mistake number 8 is hard edges that should be soft. So you can see I've started painting a flower here, and this edge, look at this lovely softness I've got by working on damp paper. But over here I forgot to do that. I put the colour on and now it's really got this this nasty hard edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to soften this by tiny little circles with a piece of barely damp cotton wool. I want to make sure that I don't go out of the area where I'm working. So I might just mask that bit off there so that I'm not affecting the other petal at all. Let's move that around a little bit, and that just stops me going into the bit that's already looking nice. So again, I'm going to get this this piece of barely damp cotton wool and just tiny circles. I'm not pressing hard at all here because we want to get that sort of faded, blended edge. So really, really lightly, and I'm just going to work and work and work until I see I'm getting that faded effect. It's not as good as the other side, but it's a big improvement. So this is a great technique to use for clouds too. So if you look here, I'll just paint a little bit of blue sky with a cloud, and I've got these nice soft fluffy areas here, but over here I forgot to wet the paper on that side, so I've got this nasty hard edge, which I don't really want in a cloud. So again, I'm just going to get a little bit of the cotton wool. It's important that you get a clean bit, you don't work where you've already worked before. So I'm just going to turn that around so I've got a nice clean edge there. Make it into sort of a little bit of a point because I'm working in a small area, and I'm just going to do very, very gentle circles. So important here that you don't overwet the cotton wool, because if you do, you're just going to make another drying line further up, because there'll be a water line where the water from the cotton wool touches the paper. So there you go. Look how much better that cloud looks now with a soft edge. So mistake number 9, I wanted some water ripples and some foam by the seashore on this painting, on this sea here, but I've accidentally taken the blue over the areas that I meant to keep white. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this white oil pastel. Now oil pastel is actually opaque, so it will cover over the top. But I'm not just going to apply it, I'm going to put a layer of paint on top, because it can just look a bit out of place if you apply it to the top of your paper and then don't put anything on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take it horizontally like this, get some of those paler areas, water ripples coming back, and then I think by the shore here, by the rocks, we'll see if we can get an impression of some breaking water. Now, the way you apply this is really very important. I have got another whole video on using this technique. You mustn't just scribble because it really will show. But we're going to let's see if we can get some more white into this picture. Now ideally you'd use a pure white. I have to tell you, this is not a pure white, this is some kind of iridescent white, which I wouldn't normally choose, but I teach a lot of classes and one of my students has gone off with my white oil pastel. They don't do it on purpose, but they wander off with things. Right, so I've applied this white oil pastel, and now I'm going to take another layer of paint over the top. Now what this will also do is it'll darken the water a bit and give a bit more emphasis to that oil pastel that I've put in there. So working with a fairly big brush, but I've got a round brush here with a point, so I'm able to go around my little sail there. And we're going to start just working that paint across. And you'll see as I come down to the shoreline, you'll see that the paint really starts to make the pastel show up, and we get those nice effects of breaking waves. Here we go. So you can see as I put that darker colour behind them, then they start to show up more. Now you don't have to use white for this. If your waves and your little water ripples are darker than the initial layer, you can use a dark oil pastel for this too. I'm going to make sure I've got no puddles there, so I'm just going to smooth that across, and I'm just going to lift those puddles from the edge of the paper there so that they don't run back in and annoy me later. So there we are, we had our water, which was completely flat, and we didn't have any ripples on it, we didn't have any waves in the foreground because we painted over them, and we've brought them back by using white oil pastel. So mistake number 10, and I've painted over an area that I should have left white. So I've got a little boat here that I'm making in my water, but I painted over the sail by mistake. This is easily done. So what I'm going to do is get some masking tape, and again I've prepared this so that it's less sticky so it won't tear my paper, and I'm going to mask out around the outside of the area that I should have left. So just getting some of the tacky off of that, and let's try that. So what you're doing is you're protecting the bit that you don't want to touch from being rubbed at. Now with my barely damp cotton wool, I'm just going to very gently rub. And again, you want to be trying to go along the edges of the tape, not into it, because that's when you tend to get stuff getting pushed under the edges of the tape. Now, this may not take your paper back to pure white, but it will at least isolate the area and give you a colour that's pale enough that you could possibly then adjust it and put a different colour on top. So maybe you wanted your sail to be pure white and now it can't be. Well, it doesn't matter, nobody will know. So you've got this little area that you've made lighter, and of course if you want to you can make further adjustments, but here we are, we've painted over our sail and now we've brought it back. So as you've seen, it's a complete myth that watercolours can't be adjusted once the paint has dried. On my channel you're going to find lots more art techniques and art tips, so do subscribe and you can watch another video right now.